Now, David Faber.
Thank you, Mark Haynes. The euro still hovering around the 1.36 level versus the dollar, though still off the lows it hit earlier in the week. With troubles in Greece still not resolved, is now the time to buy the euro, or does it have further to fall? Well, here to talk about that and other topics around sovereign risk, Marc Faber. He is the editor and publisher of the Gloom, Doom, Boom and Doom Report. Faber, this is Faber. And I want to point out there is no relation that I think we are aware of, at least, between the two of us, though we do share the same name. Let me start off with Greece.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Some thoughts, certainly, that they're getting very close to ultimately a rescue plan for Greece. Certainly austerity measures that will be having to taken on by the Greek government. Do you believe it will ultimately work?
Well, I think they will be bailed out by indirectly the ECB, that will guarantee some bonds that they are issuing, and these bonds will then be bought by the public or by financial institutions. But I don't think it will work out, and I think other countries like Spain and probably Portugal will then also have to be bailed out eventually. And it will lead to more monetization in Europe, one of the reasons the euro has been so weak.
Why do you believe that it won't work in Greece and ultimately that Spain and Portugal will suffer a similar fate?
Well, I think the pain of the austerity will be very, very burdensome on Greece. And eventually, the economy cannot grow with the kind of budget they will have to enact, and under these conditions their currency is way overvalued, namely the euro, and so without the ability to grow, their ability to actually pay the interest and repay the debts will actually diminish.
This is a long-term issue, though, is it not? Something that will play out over years?
Yes, over years, and you know what it basically means is that governments like the federal government in the US will have to bail out some states like Illinois and California, and in Europe they have to bail out weaker countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain, and probably eventually also Italy. And so it means monetization, which is not all that bad for equities, but of course it's not favorable for bonds, for government bonds in the long run.
Simon Hobbs.
Yeah, and you end up therefore, sir, recommending people buy gold. Is that correct?
Yes, I think everybody should accumulate some gold over time. I'm not saying that today is the best buying point. As you know, gold prices hit the peak on December 3rd of last year at 1,226. And then we corrected down to $1,045 per ounce on February 5th of this year. The same day the S&P bottomed out at 1,045, and now we're at, say, 1,120. So we had a rally already, but and possibly gold can retreat somewhat. But I would recommend people to buy every month some gold forever.
You see, sir, I'm a huge fan of yours, but I have a real difficulty here that I'd like you to help me out with. If I'm looking to invest for my retirement, yes, I have a choice of investing in the American stock market, which is basically a play on change and bright people working it internationally in teams around the world and chasing the margin every day of their lives. Or I can do what you're suggesting and buy an inanimate object that sits in a dark, damp cellar somewhere that may or may not be in short supply, may or may not glitter in the correct light, but really has no productive power. Isn't gold the ultimate Ponzi scheme?
No, I don't think it's a Ponzi scheme, and it's not a liability of someone else. You really own it. It's not a liability of anyone. And you'd keep it in a safe deposit box, and its quantity cannot be increased at the same rate as you can print money, which will eventually again weaken the US dollar. I'm not saying that the dollar will go straight away down, because other currencies apparently like the euro are even worse than the US dollar at the present time. But eventually if you print money, the purchasing power of money will lose. And what will happen, stocks will adjust on the upside. But as you know, since year 2000, gold has been up strongly and the market has been moving sideways. Now there can be a period like in 2009 when stocks outperform the gold price. But I would say if you really believe in equities, then I would rather buy Vietnamese shares than US shares, because I can make a case that the economy there will grow much faster than in the United States from a much lower level, admittedly. Or I would buy Indian shares or Chinese shares or Asian shares in general. I think if you want to be in stocks, there are better alternatives than US stocks.
Mark, let me end with this question. You know, clearly you are something of a naysayer. There are plenty of people who've stood up and said similar things throughout the last decade, 2 decades, and ultimately the U.S. certainly figures out a way to get by, as do most other countries, and global growth resumes, and many of those predictions do not come to pass. Why are you confident, sitting here and talking about what you are, that ultimately this time is different?
Well, I think we went into this crisis with an unprecedented debt level. And if you compare, for instance, the Depression years, in the Depression years we didn't have credit cards and we didn't have unfunded liabilities from Social Security, from Medicare, from Medicaid. These are all debts that will come due, that have to be paid by the government. And eventually this fiscal deficit will lead to a government debt that will then, because of its increasing size, lead to sharply rising interest burden. In other words, in 10 years' time, I would estimate that between 30 to 50% of tax revenues will be spent on the interest payments on the government debt, and that will then prove to be a huge problem and necessitate the monetization, essentially, of the debt, and that will lead to a weak dollar.
And devaluation. We haven't even talked about Japan. Mr. Faber, this is Mr. Faber saying thank you. Mark, back to you.
It is my great pleasure to speak to you, my distant relative.
Thank you, Faber and Faber.